Hello and welcome. The epicenter of the global battle against the coronavirus at this time lies in New York. The United States is supposed to have the world's best medical facilities, but its response to the pandemic has been abysmal. Even developing countries seem to be doing better than the world's most advanced country. What are the global geopolitical, strategic and economic implications of the coronavirus pandemic? To diagnose the emerging new world order, I am joined at this time live from New York by the world's foremost foreign affairs expert, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed, welcome. You're at the epicenter of the entire problem at this moment. How are you doing yourself?
I'm fine. I'm staying about an hour and a half outside New York. I go into New York, into the CNN studios to do the show, my show every Sunday. But it's a whole new world, Rahul. I walk into the building; it's empty except for one security guard at the ground floor, and then one security guard at the floor I work at. I go into an empty studio, what as you know we call a flash studio. There's a robot camera, robot lights. Everything is being controlled from one studio in Atlanta, and then I have my entire team on their computers at home, working from home, but managing the show. So it's a more difficult show to put together, but we've managed to do it, and I think we're doing very well under those circumstances. For those who are real fans of the show, you'll notice we can't do as much in terms of graphics and we can't do as much in terms of editing. But there is, on the other hand, an incredible kind of urgency to what we're doing. So personally, I'm fine. Professionally, I'm fine. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the country and the world.
Okay, now zooming out, how do you think COVID-19 is changing the world as we know it forever?
That's a big question. I think that the biggest danger, I would say, is that what it is doing is pulling the world apart in a way that would be very hard to bring back together. So let's just think about it at one simple level of borders and travel. We had gotten to a point where people had gotten very used to the idea that the world was their oyster. You could move around, you could go from one place to another easily without any friction. What is possibly going to happen now is, if this continues and intensifies, you are going to see states reestablish controls on borders. Let's say you have to go somewhere, you will have to get some kind of medical certificate or a test that you have to clear before you can go somewhere. If you land in a place and they're taking temperatures at every airport, if you have fever, you will be quarantined. All of which will act as obstacles and barriers to people freely traveling and mingling. And I use that because it's a kind of metaphor. We have lived in a very globalized world for the last 30 years. You already were seeing, because of nationalism, because of protectionism, a certain amount of deglobalization. Well, that deglobalization will intensify and will affect not just goods and services, but also people, if we end up in a situation where everyone puts barriers on. Look at one central example, the European Union. Travel within the European Union, the so-called Schengen zone, you didn't even need a passport, you needed nothing. Now they have closed borders, France, Germany, Italy, for the first time in 25 years.
One of the things that we've seen over the past few weeks is increasing surveillance. A lot of the countries that have been able to get the coronavirus reasonably under control have used advanced technologies to keep a very close eye on where their citizens are, where the COVID suspects are, in a manner of speaking. How does this impact privacy going forward? At this moment, it seems reasonable. Even the government in India is rolling out an app. At this moment, no one's complaining. What are the long-term implications of this increased surveillance?
Rahul, I think you put it right. The short-term issue is not really a problem because we would all want this virus to be stopped. We would all, I think, be more than happy to provide information. There's one example I can give you. In the United States, for example, there's a thermometer maker that has, as part of the purchase agreement, you give the data. And it is able to, with 1 million thermometers, figure out where you are seeing spikes in temperature as a way of figuring out, predicting where you are going to see the next cluster of coronavirus uptakes. So this part of it is obviously necessary. People will be more than willing to give it. But what it does do is it opens the door to what some people have called surveillance capitalism and the surveillance state, where it is possible theoretically for the state to amass enormous amounts of information about you. And of course, India has thought about this issue already because of Aadhaar. The way I would put it is this: you cannot undo the technological wave. You cannot unlearn the fact that these technologies exist, that this data can be used. What those of us who live in democracies with the rule of law have to do is to make sure that you put in place very good, strong rules that say these are the conditions under which you can use it, these are the constraints, these are the checks, these are the balances. Without those, individual liberty will be threatened. But I think with those, we can live with it. We can, just in the ways we've lived with, various protections we all have from terrorism, for whatever it is. But there is a real tension, and it's very important that we not just allow the government to impose whatever its rules are. This is an area where civil service, civil society needs to participate. Judges, lawyers, we have to get everybody involved in this so that we end up with a system where people, the government does have the tools it needs to deal with emergencies like this, but it should be in emergencies. There should be otherwise constraints. There should be checks and balances. And I fear that, what happens in emergencies never gets undone. And that's why it's very important for there to be a next stage after all this, where we ask ourselves, how do we create a system that we can live with that allows individual liberty, democracy to flourish, while at the same time allowing the state the capacity it needs?
This is a global crisis which called for a global response, but it's really thrown up the crumbling global order. What are the implications for multilateral bodies like the World Health Organization, which have come so much under attack? At every moment, questions are being asked about whether they're giving authentic advice, whether people can believe their advice, and increasingly, their credibility seems to have been smashed to smithereens.
Yeah, look, this is the fundamental challenge, Rahul. This is a global phenomenon. There's nothing we have seen really before that is truly as global as this. This is almost a kind of biblical challenge because this is a genuine global threat to the entire planet, to every society. And so what you would want to see is a global response. This is a case where it really emphasizes to us, it seems to me, our shared humanity. We are all vulnerable. Rich, poor, black, white, brown, it doesn't matter. The virus does not discriminate in any way, right? And so what you need is a global response. You need a human response, from all of humankind. And instead, what we're seeing is that only the virus is globalized. Every response to it is narrow, national, parochial, and as a result, suboptimal, bad, right? Because what you really need is to coordinate these travel advisories and travel closings so that you can smoothly move people. If you're going to say nobody can travel, you give people a certain amount of time. Otherwise, you end up with what's happened in India and the United States and Europe, which is massive numbers of people crowding into train stations, airports, which sort of defeats the purpose of the travel bans in the first place. You want a pooling of resources and a coordination of research so that scientists are sharing all the information so we get the vaccine fast, rather than the Chinese quietly doing their thing and the Americans doing their thing and the Germans doing their thing. You would want, when you start to reopen, you would want there to be a coordination, because if you want to try and reopen travel, you want to have similar standards in various countries, so you don't have this crazy patchwork where you're trying to figure out, well, if I want to go to Europe, what tests do I have to get, and if I want to go to India, what? All these things call for a common approach. But instead, people have been pulled, backward. The WHO is really just the symbol of it, because the truth of the matter is what really has to happen is at a international governmental level, you need a much greater degree of cooperation. And then you can agree to place some of that coordinating authority with the WHO, or we can create a new body, or it could be done by the G20. But our fundamental problem is that when we are threatened globally, we are retreating nationally. We are becoming more tribal, when the answer is obviously we need to be more global. And it's a stretch, but the trouble is we won't solve this problem, and the next one could be worse. Remember, this is not airborne. You could end up with a pandemic which is airborne, in which case it really shuts down life in a way that we can't even imagine now. How would we deal with that challenge? And this is why I say the great tragedy is that the United States is absent, because, look, nobody likes American hegemony, but in the absence of it, you end up with a vacuum, you end up with chaos, you end up with, no coordination. And for the time being, we don't have an alternative. Nobody, in my opinion, nobody is going to accept Chinese leadership, and so you're stuck with either U.S. leadership or a power vacuum and chaos. And right now, the U.S. administration is not even trying to assert U.S. leadership. It's a very bad luck that we have come across a global challenge at the same time that you have the most nationalist American president in 70 years.
China is attempting to use this global vacuum to enhance the speed of its global march. How successful have those efforts been? We've seen on Chinese media a massive propaganda effort. They're sending their doctors, they're sending masks and ventilators and surgical gear to Italy and to Europe, and they're making it seem as if China is coming to the world's rescue. How successful has that propaganda effort been in your view? And is this changing the way the world perceives China?
I think it's difficult to tell. I think obviously the countries that are receiving supplies are grateful. Obviously they regard China as playing a positive role in those situations. But I don't think that it changes the fundamental reality for many democracies that China is a system that is very different. And as a system, it's very difficult to admire. You may respect it, but it's difficult to admire, and it's difficult to imagine being willing to, kind of give leadership to. I think the Chinese will try, but their experiences even before this in Africa were countries take the money, they take the assistance, but you need more than that. You need soft power. Right now, China has very little soft power. You don't get soft power by giving people medical masks. You give soft power by both embodying and by leading on a set of values that the world is, wants to move toward. And I tend to still believe that what most people in the world want is to live lives in which they have individual rights, individual dignity, individual capacity, and that is not exactly what is happening in China. I may be wrong, but I think that it is still the West and America's to lose this leadership challenge. That China is not a natural fit. I mean, you just think about it in Asia. Are the Japanese willing to accept Chinese leadership? Is India willing to accept Chinese leadership? Is Vietnam, is Korea? And so I think it's more challenged than people realize. I think that if you got another American president, things could turn around pretty quickly. But for now, you face the reality of a China on the march, and America absent, and a world in chaos.
It's interesting the way you put it. This crisis has seen two contrasting approaches. On the one side, you've got the Prime Minister Narendra Modi approach of a complete national lockdown. On the other side, you've got the Brazilian President Bolsonaro saying, I'll ride out the storm, I've been an athlete, it's just a flu, I'll deal with it, and let's bash on regardless. Only time will tell which of those two responses was right. But what do you make of the manner in which different countries have responded? And sitting where you are, what do you think the world is making of the lockdown in India and India's response? The numbers so far very low, but India's response to this global crisis.
I think Prime Minister Modi faced a very difficult choice. There is no easy way out of this. I think he did ultimately the right thing, though it could have been better executed. I think he took a bold measure, which was to act early on the basis of the data. As you say, India has very few cases, but with the full realization of this fundamental fact, which is the Indian healthcare system is so fragile, weak, particularly in rural areas, that if you ended up with a spiraling trajectory, the healthcare system would not just crash, but it would crash in a massive way, and you would have not just deaths from coronaviruses, but deaths from everything else, because the hospitals would be overcrowded, the system would have broken down. I think that was a reasonable supposition for two reasons. One, the Indian healthcare system is very bad. As you know, hospitals per bed, per capita spending on healthcare in India is abysmally low, and maybe this will start a debate about that. But the second is that the nature of the spreading of this virus, which is essentially spreading exponentially. Let me give you an example. I think roughly 4 weeks ago, the United States had about 200, 250 cases. It now has 100,000 plus, right? So that gives you a sense of how fast this can move. The power of exponential growth is crazy, because you go from 20 cases and you can end up with 2 million in a month or a month and a half. And if that is and the virus seems to be growing exponentially almost everywhere. So if you were in that situation, what the best bet is to just try to suppress as much as you can. And then when you open up in 3 weeks, you have slower rates of spread. You can identify the places. Now, the great challenge will be, once you open up in India, can the Indian government do the kind of identification, testing, contact tracing, and isolation that a South Korea did, that a China did? I worry very much about it. The Indian bureaucracy is not good. The healthcare system does not have that capacity. So I would hope that what the Prime Minister is doing is taking these 3 weeks as an opportunity to really ensure that when you come out of it, you do that. Because if you don't, again, the problem is with small numbers, if it becomes exponential growth, you will have taken 3 weeks and done nothing. Trump actually made one good decision. In January, he banned travel from China. That gave America about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. He did nothing with it. He minimized the problem. He refused to talk about it. He refused to issue orders for quarantines. So the challenge for India will come when this lockdown ends. I support this measure. It's a terrible thing, and I know the human cost of it, but it was the rational thing to do given the evidence. The question is what happens when you come out.
When we met last at Davos, you spoke of deglobalization. At that time, slowbalization was a theme as well. The world slowing down, not expecting the kind of economic growth we've seen in the past couple of decades. What do you think will be the big idea that drives the global order in the post-COVID-19 world?
Look, it's up for grabs. Clearly, there will be people who will say this is a sign of the problems of globalization. You have, all these viruses running around the world. We're importing, all these problems. In America, they're trying to blame it all on China. The problem with that is the world is already interconnected. You can try to cordon yourself off, but it won't really work. The Brazilians may think that they can ensure that the virus doesn't come into Brazil. It's already in Brazil. It's all over the world, because the nature of the world we live in is already globalized. There's already trade, commerce, contact around the world. And by the way, that has produced all enormous, good things. I mean, hundreds of millions of people in India and China have been lifted out of poverty. For the rest of the world, you have had access to cheap goods and cheap food. which has raised the quality of life and standard of living all over the world. Let's not forget all the great things that have happened as a result of this contact and commerce and trade and travel. But there will be people who will say, pull up the drawbridge, build walls, let's look inward from, and look, this is a world that I grew up in the 1970s in India. The whole idea was, you want to have as little contact with the outside world as possible, high tariffs, import substitution, non-convertible currency, all that. And what you end up with is a world of impoverishment and stagnation and parochialism, and your horizons get narrowed, your world gets narrowed. I would much prefer that what we take from this is we do live in a global world, and our challenges are all global. Then it's not just with regard to this pandemic. Think about global warming. Think about the challenges on trade, where you want to create some coordinated model where everybody is playing by the same rules. Think about the challenges of having to deal with things like cyber war and cyber attacks. All these networks are globalized. The problems are all globalized. The advantages are all globalized. Our mistake is we insist that the only solution to these things is national. So what I would like to see is not some kind of world government. That's absurd. Nobody wants that. But a greater degree of global governance, not global government, global governance, coordination, pooling together resources, pooling together ideas, and recognizing that fundamentally we are in this together. I mean, if this pandemic doesn't make us realize that we are in this together, what will? We face a global challenge. It is a global threat. It does not distinguish between nations. It does not distinguish between races, castes, creeds. Everyone is in it together. And so if this should spur a greater level of global cooperation. As always, this is the nature of human existence. We have free will. We can make these choices. There is nothing is written. It is going to be ours to choose. Do we go down the path of closing down, shutting down, looking inward, or do we choose this path to broaden to build the bridges, to try to connect, to try to find ways to cooperate? I know which is a better path. I can't tell you with great confidence, given the leadership of the world right now, that we would choose that better path.
Fareed Zakaria, it's always fascinating setting up a conversation with you. I don't think anybody who's watching would have thought there'd ever be a time when the United States seems to be coming apart in its response to a crisis, and other countries far less developed than the US seem to have their act far more in order. So we are in a new world. You help viewers try and make some sense of a world where all the variables are still moving. For joining us from New York, thank you so much. Please stay safe. You're saying you're doing your best to stay home. I hope that your family in Mumbai, your family in New York, they're all staying safe. Thank you, Fareed Zakaria, for joining us.
Thank you, Rahul.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.